Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Vicarage here at Penn. Lovely to see you on this sunny-ish Thursday morning. I hope you're going to have a lovely day. Good to see you this morning. We are working, and we're now towards the back end of the letter of Paul to the Ephesians. We're in chapter 6. And so without further ado, I'm going to read you now Ephesians chapter 6, starting to read at verse 1. Reading verses 1 to 9. Short this morning. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honour your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, so it may be well with you, and you may live long on the earth. And fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, in singleness in heart, as you obey Christ, not only while being watched, but in order to please them, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Render service with enthusiasm, as to the Lord, and not to men and women, knowing that whatever good we do, we will receive the same again from the Lord, whether we are slaves or free. And masters, do the same to them. Stop threatening them, for you know that both of you have the same master in heaven, and with him there is no partiality. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, parents, isn't that a lovely first verse? Children, obey your parents. Wonderful words these. Reminds me of that wonderful carol, Once in a Royal David City, which I always think must have been written by some frustrated parent somewhere, where it says, Christian children all must be mild obedient, good as he. And you can almost hear parents all around the congregation saying, absolutely. Are you listening to this? You can almost hear it saying. And as I hear here, I can almost hear my own mother saying, why didn't he obey this all those years ago? Except to say, I think, I'm joking, of course I am. Actually, firstly, parenting with discipline is important. Actually, I do think, despite how liberal and free we may like to think we are, actually, he says here, bring your children with discipline. Children do need boundaries. We all need boundaries in life. Actually, to be completely free is actually not to be completely free. To be completely free means to live with chaos, and that's not good. Actually, children, and don't we all, need boundaries. When we have if we're involved with an earthquake or something, we try and grab onto something which is strong. Then actually children do need proper boundaries. But I think the other thing which I think is absolutely salutary, and it's interesting that Paul says it to fathers and not to mothers, actually. It's verse 4, he says, and fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. In other words, let's make sure that's okay. It's right to have discipline in the house, but let's not make sure that we are winding our children up. Let's make sure that we're not being overbearing, that we are loving our children, that we are walking the walk as well as talking the talk. As somebody once said, there's a difference between commanding respect and demanding respect. Actually, if people want to be respected, they've got to behave respectfully. And I think as parents, we need to make sure that we are consistent, that we're not hypocritical, that we are kind, that we're loving, and that we are modelling good behaviour. I once heard a lovely tribute she was actually a vicar's wife. And at the funeral, one of the children said, my mother, she said, she was the same all the time. She was the same at home around the breakfast table as she was in the parish or whatever. In other words, she was completely consistent. She walked the walk as well as talked the talk. She was absolutely consistent. She lived it down to her core. And I think that's what it means here. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. So I think as parents, and Paul is going into the household here, children do need boundaries. Actually, we all need to know where we stand. And actually, it's important that children grow up with boundaries and are taught in the name of the Lord. But it's also important that as parents, we don't just demand respect, but actually we command respect, and that we behave as we should do, and actually behave in such a way that our children actually honour what we do and what we say. That's the first bit. Now, the second few verses read quite troubling to us because it's all about slavery. And it's difficult because we know nowadays that slavery is wrong. And part of us wishes that Paul had said, slavery is a bad thing, we should abolish it. and also we kind of we often think that. And it reads a bit odd. It reads like slaves, you should be good. But we wish Paul in some ways had said, isn't slavery a bad thing? Well, I'd like to say 3 or 4 things this morning. Firstly, before we get all hoity-toity and look back on previous generations rather arrogantly, let's remember a couple of things first. Firstly, let's talk about modern slavery. There's a huge amount of slavery going on in the world today, and including in our country as well. There's a very good restaurant that we used to eat in a lot that was actually found out for exercising modern slavery. We need to say we don't eat in there anymore. And there's an awful lot of slavery around in the world today. Perhaps not in the same way that it was 200 years ago, but there is nonetheless an awful lot of slavery today. Secondly, even in lovely 21st century Britain, there's an awful lot of a kind of slavery as well. In those days, you were a slave if you owed someone some money. If you owed them money and you couldn't pay it back, you became that person's property. Now, it's a bit different nowadays, but you think of the amount of money that's owed in things like debt, on credit cards and payday loans and all this type of stuff. I forget what the average debt per household in this country, and it's scary. And you think of the amount of money that's paid out in interest payments every year. Can that person really say that they're not entirely the property of whichever loaning organisation it may be? So I think we ought to be careful, firstly because of modern slavery, obviously, but also because in our society, the amount of debt that's going on is really quite scary in lots of ways too. So before we get all hoity-toity, let's look at ourselves a bit first as a society. The next thing to remember is who got slavery abolished. The school I went to, a place called Pocklington School in Yorkshire, I went to boarding school for many years, so 9 years when I was a kid. One of the main chief benefactors, as they used to call him, was a man called William Wilberforce. And he was one of the architects of the abolition of slavery. And William Wilberforce was also, let's not forget, a very, very devout Christian. So let's remember, it was actually the Christians who actually abolished slavery. And so whilst we often look back at the troublesome parts of the history of the Christian church, let's not forget also some of the good sides as well. And actually it was Christians, devout evangelical Christians, that were principally responsible for the abolition of slavery. But as to what Paul says, I think whilst it's possible to wish Paul had said, why don't we abolish slavery? And okay, let's not forget the context that Paul was writing in. Let's not forget that Paul wrote this 1,700 years before slavery was abolished, right? Paul wrote at a time when if someone was your slave, they were entirely your property. They were as important to you as a tool would be in your toolbox today. That's all it was, okay? And you've got to remember that's the context. Paul wrote in a time when slaves had no rights at all. You were entirely the property of your master and no rights at all whatsoever. And 1,700 years before slavery was abolished. Let's put Paul in his context. And in this context, in which slaves had no rights at all, Paul writes a couple of very, very radical things. Firstly, he writes to the masters saying, don't mistreat your slaves. Look after your slaves properly. Which is a bit like saying, look after your toolkit properly. It's almost interfering in the way other people live their lives. But Paul radically says to these slave owners, look after your slaves properly. In other words, you as a master, they may be, but actually you have responsibilities for them too. And he also says something even more radical, which is actually when it comes to it, you're only the earthly master. We all have one master in heaven, under whom, in whom, with whom there is no partiality. We have one master in heaven. And he's saying to these masters, actually, all of you come under the same master, which is God. And that's who. And when he talks about earthly masters here, the word is literally masters in the flesh. What he's saying is we all have one real master, which is God. So, in our talk for today, firstly, okay, back to parenting. Children need boundaries and children need discipline, but as parents, we have a responsibility to make sure that we're living well and that we are commanding, not merely demanding respect in our faith. And as far as slavery is concerned, okay, before we get too high-minded about Paul, let's look at modern slavery in society today. And let's look at the amount of debt which is owed to people even in our country today. But let's also remember the two radical things that Paul did. Firstly, for the first thing ever, he's actually saying that masters have a responsibility to your slaves. And he was saying that in a day before they did. And secondly, he's saying, even more radical, actually, you're only master in the flesh. In reality, we have one master, and we all have the same master who shows no partiality,